Thank you for having me, and thanking you for that generous introduction. I don't really consider myself in exile. In former life, I was a follower of Chairman Mao Zedong, live like him, dare to struggle, dare to win. That's what I sound like when I was your age. One of my favorite stories with Mao Zedong was, for those of you who know the history, in 1965, he was isolated in the Chinese Communist Party. He was in exile, as it were. And the famous story is that he meets the French cultural minister, André Malraux, at the Forbidden City. And as Malraux is leaving Chairman Mao and entering his limousine, Mao walks over to him and whispers in his ear, "I am alone with the masses." So I like to think I'm alone with the masses. I had several possible lecture topics for this evening, and this, I think, is a generally informed audience, and the kinds of topics I normally speak about would be maybe more heavily footnoted, but the general message, I think, would be familiar to people in this room. And so I decided at the last minute to talk about a different topic this evening, one which would be of more interest, perhaps, to an activist audience, and also because several people were kind enough to drive me here, and I wouldn't want to inflict on them the same lecture. Unlike Fidel, I do have a sensitivity for the audience I'm speaking to. So the topic I'll speak about this evening is the one that I'm currently writing about, and which I think will be of some interest. The formal title, the title of the book is A Farewell to Israel, the Coming Breakup of American Zionism. And basically what the topic is, or I should say the origin, the genesis of the topic is that I've noticed in the last few years I've been active, as Adam said. I first became publicly active in the Israel-Palestine conflict in June 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon. And so we're already at a quarter-century anniversary of sorts. And the thing that's most striking in recent years is the complete collapse of the other side, as it were. And as somebody who wrote to me the other day from Columbia University, he said that now in public events, it's almost becoming too easy. The other side doesn't show up. When they do, they're very cautious about what they say. And what you basically see as a general picture is that those who are supporting Israel are now on college campuses reduced to an ethnic core. It's only the Jewish students, and of the Jewish students, it's really only about a third. 1/3, the Hillel crowd, 1/3 are basically indifferent, and 1/3 are supporting the other side, our side. Now, whereas with the Palestinian side, it's gone now well beyond the ethnic core. It's now reaching well into the mainstream. At a typical audience, the audience won't be more than 1/5 or 1/6 Arab or Muslim. It's going to be overwhelmingly pretty mainstream people who are showing up. And the crowds are getting larger. The crowds, for Israel are getting significantly smaller. And so basically what I want to look at is how do you account for this phenomenon? What exactly is going on? And that's what I want to talk about this evening. In order to do so, you have to have some historical background, and also you have to shed a large number of myths, which unfortunately many people, I think, mistakenly assume, especially the younger generation. There's the famous line often quoted, of the Hungarian Marxist George Lukács, that you have to look at the present as history. And I think very often, especially with this conflict, people don't see or don't know or are unfamiliar with the historical context. So we'll go back a little ways to try to flesh in that context, and its relevance will become clear as I proceed. It will come as a surprise, I think, to many of the younger people in the room that Israel only recently became a focus of American Jewish life. After World War II, the barriers to Jewish assimilation began rapidly to fall away. Before World War II, there were significant barriers to Jewish entry into the professions. If you looked at, for example, the Ivy League universities, only a handful of Jews taught there. And Professor Chomsky, for example, likes to tell the story that the reason MIT became a first-rate science and engineering school is because it didn't allow any Jewish mathematicians, or I should say Harvard didn't allow any Jewish mathematicians or physicists on its faculty, and so they all ended up walking down the street to MIT. And that was the picture, basically, until after World War II. Now the barriers to Jewish assimilation begin to fall away, and the opportunities for Jewish power and privilege, as it were, the American dream, begin to open up for American Jewry. And it's exactly at this moment when opportunities are now beckoning that this state of Israel is the state of Israel is created. And this state of Israel claims to be the state of the Jewish people, to speak in the name of the Jewish people, and also claims the primary loyalty of the Jewish people. And in many ways, this is now a catastrophe for American Jews, because Jews have historically always been burdened with this claim or this bogey of what's called dual loyalty. That is, Jews are loyal to their nation state, but they have a higher loyalty to international Jewry, from which all of this stuff about the international Jewish conspiracy and so forth arise. Well, now all of a sudden a state emerges which claims the primary loyalty of world Jewry. And the dual loyalty bogey suddenly now has a concrete institutional form. It's no longer just a creation or myth. It's now a factual reality. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, he says in the early 1950s that Jews must assist the state of Israel in all conditions and under any circumstances, whether the government to which the Jews in question owe allegiance desire it or not. And when he made this statement, it created a veritable hysteria among American Jewry, who became very frightened that here he was, as it were, advertising to the world that Jews are not loyal to the United States. Their first loyalty is to Israel. Afterwards, there was a lot of back and forth diplomacy, and Ben-Gurion was effectively compelled to retract the statement, but the institutional fact remained. And so what this means in concrete terms, which only people who are very much older than most in this room would know, is that from 1948 to 1967, Israel figured barely at all as a feature of American Jewish life, let alone American life generally. You take the case of what is probably the most respected Jewish sociologist of his generation, and maybe of all sociologists, a fellow named Nathan Glazer. Nathan Glazer, in 1957, writes a book entitled American Judaism, and he writes, and I'm quoting him now, Israel has had remarkably slight effects on the inner life of American Jewry. Or you take the case right before the June 67 war, this fellow named Elie Wiesel, you may know him as the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, though people often wonder what did he do to earn it. Mr. Wiesel was asked by Israel's most influential paper, Haaretz, in April 67, what do you think we can do to win over Jews to their Jewishness? Because there was a fear back then of rampant assimilation. And Mr. Wiesel responded, the Jewishness of Jewish youth can still be reached, but not through Israel. Perhaps through the problems of Jews in Russia, perhaps through questions about the Holocaust, but not through Israel. Among all categories of American Jews, the category which was most aloof from, estranged from, indifferent to Israel were American Jewish intellectuals. That is to say, the crowd which are the precursors of the Jewish neoconservatives. If you look at the studies, a large number of books have been written on these Jewish intellectuals. During the 1930s, they would congregate around these magazines called Partisan Review, some of you may know, Politics Magazine, and so forth. And many studies were done of them beginning in the 1980s, and many of them had just begun to write their autobiographies. And when you look at the studies, what's most striking is Israel never comes up. Up until 67, you can go through the indices of these books, you can read them carefully. Israel is just not there. It's not at all a factor in American Jewish intellectual life. Again, these are not speculative issues. You can take the case, Jews like to have symposia where they gather together their brightest minds, assuming that there are some who are not the brightest minds. And, they ask them all sorts of questions about their Jewish identity. So you take the case, the American Jewish community, the main Jewish organization of its time, and they, just before the June 67 war, they have a symposium, Jewish Identity Here and Now. And they ask 31 of the best minds in the Jewish community, how do you understand, how do you comprehend your Jewish identity? Of the 31, only 3 made any mention of Israel as being part of their identity, and of those 3, they only mentioned it, 2 of the 3 only mentioned it to dismiss the importance of Israel, which is to say, of the brightest minds in the Jewish community, only 1 gave a hoot about Israel. You can take the most interesting case, I think. There's this fellow, regrettably he's still with us, a fellow named Norman Podhoretz. He was the editor of Commentary magazine. Some of you, how many of you even know Commentary magazine? Yeah, not the younger people. There were 2 main periodicals on the left and the right. On the left was Dissent magazine, on the right was Commentary magazine, and the famous joke by Woody Allen is, if they were ever combined, they would be called dysentery. And he's clever. Annie Hall is very funny, I have to admit it. He's a Johnny One Note, it's the same thing over and over again, but Annie Hall is funny. In any case, so there's this character named Norman Bothoritz, and he, along with this other character named Irving Kristol, are generally said to be the godfathers of neoconservatism. And Podhoretz made part of his reputation on being a fanatical, hysterical, as it were, supporter of the state of Israel. And he remains so till this day. And Podhoretz, at a relatively young age, in his 20s, he became the editor of Commentary magazine. And it's very interesting to go back and look at the actual history. During his period of editorship before the June '67 war, Israel doesn't come up at all, barely. Two simple examples. During the first year of his editorship, there were 99 feature articles, main articles in Commentary. Of those 99, only 2 mention Israel or Zionism. That's it. The period up to the June '67 war, January through June '67, there are 57 articles. On Israel, just 2. And the articles are very nondescript, like, wedding in Galilee, or bar mitzvah in Tel Aviv. Not exactly the most political articles. Some of you who are older will remember Podhoretz's famous autobiography. It was called Making It. How many people remember Making It? That's impossible. No one? You remember. Okay. At least you confirm it happened. It was an event of sorts because it was so gross that he was flaunting the fact that he made it, and it was a kind of declaration of grossness by the Jewish nouveau riche. And what's striking when you read it, and it was, as I say, a big event back then, it's his autobiography. Here's this guy who became so famous for his fanatical support of Israel. You go back and read it, there is exactly 1 mention, a half a sentence on Israel in the whole book. It's nothing. Didn't figure at all in American Jewish life, except as an object of charity. Occasionally you would plant a tree in Israel, or else grow a weed, whatever. That was it. Things dramatically change after the June '67 war. As Podhoretz says in another book, Israel became the religion of the American Jews. And the obvious question is, well, what happened? And what happened basically was, fundamentally what happened, is that Israel now became a strategic asset of the United States, as the expression has it. And so now the issue of dual loyalty not only didn't arise anymore, but now if you were pro-Israel, you were actually super loyal to the United States, because there was Israel on the front lines defending American interests against the third world Arab hordes, protecting our oil, which happened to be located in the Middle East. And not only were they protecting American interests, dying for American interests, but unlike the American GIs in Vietnam, they were actually winning. And not only were they winning, but unlike the American GIs in Vietnam, and this is the period when there were all the exposés of the atrocities that were going on, Israel was protecting our interests, Israel was winning, and Israel was winning while practicing, it was said, purity of arms. They were doing it in a moral way. So now a paradox occurs. Zionism as an idea originates in the notion that Jews cannot assimilate to the non-Jewish world, to the Gentile world, the European world. Jews cannot assimilate. Zionism's main product is the State of Israel. And now, paradoxically, by swearing allegiance to Israel, American Jews are now for the first time able to fully assimilate into American life. Because by swearing allegiance to Israel, they are defending Judeo-Christian culture against those Arab third world hordes. So now, the more pro-Israel you are, the more pro-American you become. And so, many Jews, Jewish intellectuals, become pro-Israel. And in addition, American Jews have been, continue to be, and will probably continue to be in the future, they're overwhelmingly liberal in their values because, among other reasons, liberalism has done them well. The rule of law, separation of church and state, equality before the law, all those conventional liberal values. It was on the basis of those values that American Jews were able to flourish and thrive. And it seems as if Israel embodies all of those values. It's bringing the enlightened values. It's a besieged beacon of the Enlightenment values in the Middle East. At least on the surface, it seems to be an impressive democracy, practices purity of arms, and so on and so forth. And so for American Jewry, it becomes a source of pride to identify with the state of Israel. It seems to be, in many ways, the United States over there. You read the history, it's not very much unlike our own history. At least it looked that way. Israel was just the Alamo all over again. For those of you who are of a youthful generation, you won't remember, but there was this famous Disney film, Remember the Alamo. How many people have seen it? Okay, not bad. The others, you're culturally impoverished.
Says who?
Says me. And there is, I remember as a kid rooting for the folks in the Alamo. It was Jim Bowie, Lieutenant Rip Travers. Was it Davy Crockett, right? Davy Crockett. And I hated passionately that General Santa Anna. Every night I thought of ways to throttle that guy. How could he kill Jim Bowie and, Davy Crockett, born on the mountaintop of Tennessee? Bravest man you ever did see. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. And Israel, for those of you who don't know the story, there's General Santa Anna besieging the Alamo. Alas, he prevails in that particular battle. And Israel resembled in many ways the Alamo. It was this outpost in a barbaric area, but the difference, of course, is Israel wins, it doesn't lose. What's happened, basically, is that whereas in the initial decades of its occupation, Israeli policy appeared to many defensible and basic ethical principles, in fact, the occupation was said to embody those principles. It was said to be a liberal occupation or an enlightened occupation. That kind of defense of Israel has now become less and less tenable. The era of the beautiful Israel has passed, it seems irrevocably, and the ugly Israel that has replaced it is a growing embarrassment. Now, in my view, it is not so much that Israel behaves worse than before, but rather the actual record of Israel's history has finally caught up with it, and the truth can no longer be denied. Apparently at this school, they're still trying to deny it, judging by the books that were assigned, but generally speaking, if you read the historians who currently write on the subject across the board, the history they're writing is no longer the way we read it when we were growing up. Growing up, the famous historical novel was called Exodus by Leon Uris, and then it became a movie. How many people know that? Okay. No, Paul Newman. If you want, we can do it all together. This land is mine. God gave this land to me. Who sang it? Pat Boone. Come on. But you did a beautiful rendition. I saw it in your eyes. I don't know whether you were remembering Paul Newman or not, but...
certainly not Pat Boone.
Not Pat Boone, right. But certainly Paul Newman. And basically what we studied back then, you could say with only a little bit of exaggeration, it was basically Exodus, Leon Uris's Exodus with footnotes. That's how the history was written back then. Nowadays, that just doesn't pass. The history looks very differently. Whoever you read, really, pretty much across the board, you can easily teach a course on by mainstream Israeli historians, books by them. You get the same general picture as if you were to read a person on the left. It doesn't change very radically. Similarly, back then the image, as I mentioned earlier, when it came to human rights, was the image of purity of arms. That's the famous expression. You read papers like the Washington Post, and they would say things like Israel is unique among armies in the world because it practices purity of arms. Nowadays, you read the human rights reports of mainstream organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. No, it doesn't look very much like purity of arms. And if you look at the diplomatic record, the claim used to be that Israel is forever in search of an Arab partner for peace, or in the famous epigram of Abba Eban, the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity for peace. Well, that record doesn't look the same anymore when you look at what the diplomatic scholars, what the legal record actually shows. As this history became steadily more known in the past 20 years, Israel resorted to its usual weapons, or Israel and their supporters resort to the usual weapons to try to deflect attention from the record. One was, of course, to drag in the Nazi Holocaust, and the second was to claim a forever resurgent new anti-Semitism. Those weapons are no longer very effective. The Holocaust as a weapon has been dulled by overuse. Most people have been Holocausted out. And the new anti-Semitism has become, or the claim of anti-Semitism has become less and less credible for the simple reason that it's now being directed at mainstream people. When you attack people on the extremes and the fringes and call them anti-Semitic, they never really had the resources, as it were, to fight back. But when you claim, for example, that someone like former President Carter is an anti-Semite, he both has the reputation and the resources, that is, he's able to get on mainstream television and fight back. And so what you see is these claims are no longer sticking. They are losing all of their credibility because most people know enough about Jimmy Carter to know there may be many flaws in his character, and there are many negative features to his record as a president, and I'm not referring to Iran. but anti-Semitism simply is not a credible claim against him. Well, the net effect of this is, of all of these phenomena, as I would call it, the increasing knowledge about what's happening there and what actually happened. The increasing knowledge is Israel's stock has precipitously fallen in recent years. You start with Europe, 2003, a poll of the European Union names Israel the biggest threat to world peace. A BBC poll in 2007, it looked at the attitudes towards 12 major nations in the world. The most negative image of those 12 was Israel. This past year, Israel got slightly up. It managed to just rise one rung up above Iran. And if you consider the kind of PR Iran gets as compared to Israel, it's quite amazing how low Israel's stock has fallen. In the case of the U.S., the picture is not quite there yet. Overall, Israel has a favorable image among Americans, judging from polls, and certainly Americans are more sympathetic to Israel than they are to Palestinians. On the other hand, overwhelmingly, Americans support, judging again from polls, an even-handed U.S. policy in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and a sizable minority of Americans believe that U.S. policy tilts too much towards Israel. Americans, which I'll return to in a moment, overwhelmingly favor a two-state settlement on the June 1967 border. What you can say in general about American support for Israel, it's very clear when you are sort of out there, the support may be broad, but it's not very deep. What does that mean in practical terms? So, for example, if a newspaper writes a critical article about Israel, whether it's the Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and there will be letters written in objecting to the article, it's always the case that the letters are only signed by Jews. You're never going to see, apart from the Christian fundamentalists, which I'll leave aside for a moment, but mainstream people are not going to any longer rise to Israel's defense. A 2007 Anti-Defamation League poll found that American support for Israel is much less than for, say, the United Kingdom or Japan. It falls basically within the area of India and Mexico. Now, if you consider what kind of press Mexico and Mexicans are getting, again, it's a significant decline for Israel's standing in the United States. The most interesting poll findings are among American Jews. There you find, to quote one survey from 2005, the attachment of American Jews to Israel has weakened measurably in the last few years, continuing a long-term trend. American Jews care less, talk less, and act pro-Israel less than ever before. The main pollster is a fellow named Stephen Cohn. He seems to have devoted his life to polling Jews on every imaginable topic. I can barely imagine a more dull topic, or more dull life endeavor. He writes that in the long run, a polarization of American Jewry is likely. A small group of pious Jews will grow more pious and attached to Israel, while the larger group of Jews will drift away. And then some of the findings are actually kind of astonishing. They were, at any rate, to me. 2006, they asked, how close do you feel to Israel? Among Jews under 40, 1/3 said distant. And then a 2007 poll was asked, if Israel were destroyed, would you feel it as a personal tragedy? Now, I think it'll come as a surprise to many of you. When they were asked, Jews under 35, would Israel's destruction be a personal tragedy for you? Less than half said yes, which was very surprising. I found myself in an unusual place because Personally, I would find it a tragedy. I think the destruction of any culture or any country is a tragedy, and I probably would be personally appalled by it. But among the under 35 generation, there's been obviously there are different ways to interpret it. Your generation, you have a different ranking system. First comes your cell phone, then comes your BlackBerry, then comes your pager, and then comes the rest of the world. Oh, I'm sorry, I left out Facebook. That's right. I know, I left out MySpace. Okay. And then comes the rest of the world. Apart from, of course, your 2,656 friends that you've listed. Anyone who has more than 3 friends is a deranged megalomaniac, but that's... Well, isn't that true? Friendship is supposed to mean something like intimacy. It's not supposed to be a mob or a crowd. I don't go to the Facebook, thank goodness, but I know people tell me they list 256 people as their friends. That's not normal.
Sounds like someone has less than 100.
I'm glad. How many gifts can I give each year? And then, apart from that category, there is somebody's very defensive about having more than 100. Speaking of which. And then there has been a large amount of elite estrangement from Israel. The most prominent cases in recent years, of course, being Mearsheimer and Walt, and the case of Jimmy Carter. In the Carter case, it's quite interesting to see the phenomena as it played itself out. Carter is probably the most respected ex-president in the history of the United States, and probably you could say justifiably so. When Carter came out with his book, the Israel lobby used all of its standard tactics to silence him. He was immediately charged. Kenneth Stein at Emory alleged he was a plagiarist. Then Alan Dershowitz alleged he was in the pay of Arab sheikhs. Then he was accused of being an anti-Semite. Then Deborah Lipstadt from Emory wrote in the Washington Post that he was a borderline Holocaust denier. Then Neil Scher alleged that he was a Nazi sympathizer. And then it was alleged that he was a supporter of terrorism. So they pulled all the stoppers on Mr. Carter. But what happened? The slime tactics are not particularly surprising. What was surprising was how unsuccessful they were. Despite all of the vicious, vitriolic, nasty, ad hominem reviews of his book, it managed to be #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And it sold 300,000 copies in hardback. Then Mr. Carter said that I want to go into the lion's den. I want to speak to the Jewish students at Brandeis, the historically main secular Jewish university. He goes to Brandeis, 2,000 students come to the auditorium to greet him, and he's already being followed by this reputation for being the Holocaust denier, this, that, and the other. Goes into the auditorium, 2,000 students, the gym. They give him 4 standing ovations. And then Mr. Dershowitz delivers the, as it were, reply to Carter. Before he even opens his mouth, 2/3 of the audience just walked out. That's a very revealing sign of where things are going, where things are heading. And the obvious question, as I said from the beginning, is, well, exactly what happened? How do you account for this remarkable change that's occurring right now as we carry on? It's happening now. The usual argument that's made that the disaffection from Israel, the technical term, if you read the Jewish literature, is they talk about the distancing of American Jews from Israel, the usual explanation is, well, Israel is not the same place as it used to be. It's become a very different place than during those golden years right after the June War. And if we're honest about these things, it is true that there has been a drastic or significant, let's not call it drastic, a significant deterioration in Israeli society. It once was a relatively egalitarian society. Wealth was relatively equitably distributed, say in the 1950s. Now Israel has among the largest gaps in income distribution in the world. There has been a significant change, and we shouldn't sort of be so obtuse or politically correct that we don't see these things. There were impressive experiments in egalitarianism, most notably the kibbutzim, but in general, it was a quite austere society. It had the appearances, and not just appearances, the reality of being a revolutionary society in many respects. And you saw it in particular in the behavior, the conduct of the leadership. These were the first generation of Zionists who then became the leaders of the State of Israel. They were genuinely committed to an idea. These were not people who were principally after privilege and power. They were committed to an ideal. They genuinely believed, for better or for worse, they genuinely believed in the idea of a Jewish state. And so they were remarkably committed, remarkably austere in their livings, in their personal conduct, and remarkably honest. Those are facts. They were also ruthless, no question about it, but ruthlessness and austerity often go hand in hand, as people familiar with the history of the left know. There were, back then, you take 1976, the Prime Minister of Israel is a fellow named Yitzhak Rabin. And Mr. Rabin has to step down from office. He has to give up his position. Why? His wife had one open bank account in the United States. No money in it. Just to even have a foreign bank account was enough to cause a scandal in Israel and force the Prime Minister to resign. Things have obviously changed quite radically. There's literally not a day that passes, including today and yesterday, literally, that an Israeli prime minister isn't being, or Israeli official or prime minister is not being indicted for some financial or sex scandal. It's a very different place. Even as late as 1996, Israel was ranked among the most transparent, that means not corrupt societies in the world. But now if you look at the most recent findings of 36 countries ranked for political corruption, one being the least corrupt, Israel is down to 20. It's behind Estonia. It's sunk considerably. And then there are all sorts of, you could say, cultural aspects of the society. Over the past 2 decades, about 50 to 70% of Israeli Jews support transferring the Israeli Arab population out of the country. A surprising finding, at least for me, of the 27 countries in the world with minority populations which are vulnerable to discrimination. So they did a study of the countries in the world which have minority populations, and these minorities are vulnerable to discrimination. Israel ranked, of the 27, it ranked 27th, the last in economic discrimination, and 26 next to the last in political discrimination. A 2007 report by the Israeli Center for Racism found 50% of the Jewish population feels fear when hearing Arabs spoken in the street. 1/3 feel revulsion, 44% feel discomfort, and 1/3 feel hatred. And only, as to quote the Israeli study, only a mere 50% believe that Jews and Arabs should enjoy equal rights. So it has changed quite significantly. But in my view, this claim has been grossly exaggerated. It's not so different than it once was. So let's take some standard examples. We're often told, where is that socialist, Zionist, enlightened leadership of the past? People like David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister. And he's contrasted with the ruthless militarist Ariel Sharon. Well, the problem with that contrast is this. If you open up Moshe Dayan, the Israeli general, his memoirs, he says Ben-Gurion did not just like Sharon, he positively adored him. Sharon for Ben-Gurion embodied the character of the Israeli Jew of Ben-Gurion's dream, a man of integrity. Or take the case of the wars. We're often told the 48 war, that war of independence, the one that's depicted in Exodus, was a war with the purity of arms, the beautiful Israelis, the bronze kibbutzniks, facing off those stench-filled Arabs. And the bad war, we're told, and the younger people, my age cohort, will remember, the bad war was supposedly the Lebanon War of 1982, when Israel killed about 18 to 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians, overwhelmingly civilians. That's supposedly the bad war. 48 is the good war. So things, they seem to have deteriorated. But it's not so. You take one of Israel's leading historians, Benny Morris, he says, the Israeli army has become a progressively cleaner army. Its record on purity of arms was far better in 1982 than it was in 1948. The picture is actually one not of Israel deteriorating, but actually improving. You take the question then of torture. Now, it's sometimes thought that there's been a dramatic deterioration in the question of Israel's resort to torture. But it's not so. Israel began torturing Palestinian detainees right after the June 1967 war. During the heyday of American Jewry's love affair with Israel, torture, according to the human rights reports, was systematic and methodical of Palestinian detainees. In fact, it's probably the case that now Israel tortures less than it did during the heyday of American Jewry's love affair with Israel. If American Jews have generally become more reticent in their support of Israel, it's not because Israel has become a fundamentally worse place, but because much more is now known about Israel's historical human rights and diplomatic record. There's broad agreement on what the record shows. It's much more difficult to pretend not to know that record, and it's no longer possible to reconcile Israeli behavior as documented in the record with basic liberal values. Let me just quickly go through what some of the record shows. So let's start with the history. There is a sprinkling of older people in the room. I'm not going to make eye contact with them because they're from the 60s and they're very sensitive about getting older. They have not quite reconciled themselves to the fact that not only are the 60s over, but they themselves are in their 60s. It's a very bitter pill to swallow, but alas, it's no longer the age of Aquarius. Though some of those 60s veterans with that glazed over look in their eyes, they may think otherwise. Well, back then, when you studied the topic of the, I have to be careful about not making facial contact with anyone over 20. You know, I'm not out to alienate people. I want to win people to a good cause. Okay, you. You couldn't be more than 14, so okay. Why are you laughing? You couldn't be either. Okay. So back then, if you studied the Israel-Palestine conflict, the most contentious historical issue, the one people used to vehemently argue over, was how the Palestinians become refugees in 1948. And the standard Israeli view, and the one which is echoed in scholarship and in mainstream political life, the claim was in 1948 the Arab army stood poised to attack the newly born state of Israel. They transmitted these radio broadcasts telling the Palestinian Arabs to leave, clear the fields for the invading Arab armies. Once the fields were cleared, then the armies would go in, sweep the Jews into the sea, and then the Palestinian Arabs could return. How many people remember that Arab radio broadcasts argument? Yeah, it was pretty conventional, yes. And then beginning the late 1980s, Israeli historians began looking into the topic, not only Israeli, but predominantly, and they reached a conclusion based on archival evidence that there's no basis for this claim about Arab radio broadcasts. And if you take the main Israeli historian of the topic, Benny Morris, he says what happened in 1948, using his term, not mine, was an ethnic cleansing. And that's now the broad consensus among historians. There is some disagreement about whether or not it was a premeditated ethnic cleansing. Mr. Morris says not really. He says there was a war, and you know in the course of war you have to clear out civilian populations in order to defeat your enemy, to clear out the civilians from their rear, and so on and so forth. So he says it wasn't really premeditated, it was just a byproduct of the war. And then others say not true. In fact, it was premeditated, it was systematic, it was intentional to clear the population out. And to show you how narrow the debate has now become, you take the case of Israel's former foreign minister, a fellow named Shlomo Ben-Ami. He's a very smart guy, in my opinion, a decent guy. He's by training a historian. He was the foreign minister in 2000 when Ehud Barak was prime minister. And he recently wrote a book called Scars of War, Wounds of Peace. And in the book, he addresses the question in passing of the Palestinian refugees. And he says, yes, I agree, it was an ethnic cleansing. But he says, I don't really agree with Morris that it was a byproduct or an accident of war. He says, no, I think it was, to quote him, meaning quoting Mr. Ben-Ami, he says, I think it was anchored in the Zionist philosophy of transfer. Transfer being the euphemism back then for expulsion. It's not very complicated. Any 6-year-old can figure it out. You want to create a Jewish state. A Jewish state means a population that's overwhelmingly Jewish demographically. And you want to create this Jewish state in an area which is overwhelmingly not Jewish, namely Palestine. Well, the only way you can square that circle is by expelling the indigenous population, which is exactly what happened. Or you take another question, leaving aside the refugee question, the other question that constantly comes up in the historical aspect of the conflict is namely those wars, what seems to be an interminable series of wars between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The 48 war, 56 war, 67 war, 68 to 70 war, the Canal War, 73 war, 82 war. Who caused them and why? And the conventional view, at least in the mainstream, is these were, as Israel likes to call them, these were no-choice wars. These were, or the other term that's often used, these were existential wars Israel had no choice but to fight them, otherwise it would have suffered a terminal defeat. That's the general claim, but that's the general claim in the media, in public life. It has no relationship whatever to what scholarship shows. And a good example is there's a very smart guy, a fellow named Zeev Maoz, Z-E-E-V, the last name is M-A-O-Z. Mr. Maoz is the former director of the Jaffe Center for Strategic Studies at Tel Aviv University, the most prestigious think tank, strategic think tank in Israel. And he recently came out with this very hefty book. It's called Defending the Holy Land. It's about 800 pages. It's a fat book. And what he does in the book is he simply goes through all the wars, 48, 56, 67, and so forth, and figures out, okay, what happened, who started, why, and so forth. Now, not in any way to denigrate Mr. Maoz's scholarship, and I think he owes me a buck or two because I promote his book more than my own. The book is basically a synthesis of secondary work. He just looks at all the scholarship, and what does he find? Obviously, this is not the time or the place to go through his detailed findings of each war, let alone all the wars, but it's not without interest to just briefly quote his conclusions. First of all, what caused these wars? And he looks at all of them. Here's his conclusion. Israel's war experience is a story of folly, recklessness, and self-made traps. None, N-O-N-E, none of Israel's wars, with a possible exception of the 1948 War of Independence, none was what Israel refers to as a war of necessity. They were all wars of choice or folly. Notice even 48, he just says a possible exception. That's the record on war, including that Six-Day War in 67, including the 73 War, the Yom Kippur War. They were all wars of choice or folly. None of them were existential wars. None of them were wars of self-defense. None of them were no-choice wars. That's the record on war, as he sees it. Again, basing himself not on original research, but looking at what all the secondary scholarship shows. What's the record on peace? We're told, Israel always in search of an Arab partner for peace. What does the record show? Israel's decision makers were as reluctant when it came to making peace as they were daring and trigger-happy when it came to making war. The official Israeli decision makers typically did not initiate peace overtures. Most of the peace initiatives in the Arab-Israeli conflict came either from the Arab world, from the international community, or from grassroots and informal channels. That's the record. Okay, the human rights record. The human rights record, our understanding of it, has dramatically changed. What does that mean? If you were active in the 1970s, 1980s on this particular issue, well, of course, Israel was torturing Palestinian detainees routinely, methodically, systematically. The problem was no human rights organization wanted to touch the issue, for good reasons and for bad. The good reasons is a sensitivity to Jewish suffering during World War II. You start talking about Jews torturing, it has this kind of, sounds like the Gestapo, so we're not going to go there. And the bad reason, of course, is it was fearful, Jews are liberal, and they give to liberal organizations. And there was a fear by organizations like Amnesty International that if you start touching Israel, the money was going to get pulled. And that was a very real and a realistic fear. Things begin to change in the early and because of that, if you wanted to cite evidence of Israeli torture, for example, you had to rely mostly on marginal figures. I'm not in any way denigrating them. They were and are great human beings. But they were people on the margins of political life, people like, for those of you who remember, and she's still with us, Leah Semmel, the Trotskyist lawyer from Israel, Felicia Langer, the Communist Party lawyer from Israel, and Israel Shahar, the organic chemist from the Hebrew University. That's the only people you could cite. And with all due respect to them, and I have the highest regard for all of them, they weren't what you could say in mainstream life, they weren't credible sources because you can always dismiss them as being fringe elements. Things begin to change quite radically in the early 1990s, and they changed for basically two reasons. Number one, the early 1990s is the first Intifada, and Israel now begins to torture Palestinian detainees. It begins to reach epidemic proportions. So the statistics are between 1987 and 1993, the period of the first Intifada. Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem, they say that Israel tortured, and I'm using their numbers, tens of thousands of Palestinian detainees, which was a very high number as compared to the entire adult male population, which was vulnerable to torture. And the second thing that changed is now Israeli human rights organizations begin to emerge, and organizations most notably B'Tselem at that time. And B'Tselem in 1990 publishes a report for the first time, a mainstream human rights organization categorically comes out and says Israel is torturing Palestinian detainees. And now organizations like Amnesty, and then later when it comes into prominence, Human Rights Watch, they have, as it were, a moral cover for attacking Israel. Number one, they can no longer really ignore it because it's become so egregious what's happening. And number two, they can always say, well, we're not anti-Semites, we're just quoting what B'Tselem is saying. And so immediately after B'Tselem comes out with its report, all the mainstream human rights organizations begin publishing their own reports documenting Israel's resort to torture. The other thing that's changed, of course, the whole language has now changed. You take the case of apartheid. Okay, when Jimmy Carter publishes his book, he has apartheid in the title, and it causes a kind of veritable hysteria. But what was more interesting about the hysteria is not the fact that there was a hysteria. There's always a hysteria. What was most interesting was how easily you can diffuse the hysteria by citing all of these mainstream figures in Israel who refer to Israeli practices in the occupied territories as apartheid. So Israel's former Attorney General Michael Ben Yair, he calls it apartheid. Israel's former Minister of Education Shulamit Maloni, she calls it apartheid. Israel's other former Minister of Education, Yossi Sarid, just 2 weeks ago in Haaretz, he says, well, if it waddles like a duck, quacks like a duck, well, it's apartheid. Israel's human rights organizations, B'Tselem, routinely refers to it as apartheid. And then you take a case, just last week, it was interesting to read. You opened up Haaretz during Mr. Carter's negotiations in the Middle East. They have an editorial. It's entitled, Our Debt to Jimmy Carter. That's the editorial. It's not Amira Haas. It's not Gideon Levy. And in it, it says as follows. It says, well, Israelis have had a lot of problems with Jimmy Carter ever since he used the word apartheid in the title of his book. And then Haaretz writes, the most influential mainstream Israeli newspaper, he says, and I'm quoting it verbatim, but the situation in the territories begs for the comparison. Well, that's really a radical change, where mainstream papers are now saying apartheid, and you have to recognize it's a very serious issue, because under international law, what's called the practices of apartheid constitute a crime against humanity. It raises very serious legal issues. And so for mainstream organizations to now be saying this is apartheid, a very significant distance has been traversed. And obviously, if you're a liberal American Jew, it's impossible to reconcile your values with allegations of that sort, allegations which have been supported and sustained by mainstream figures. And finally, there's the diplomatic record. The diplomatic record, what does it now show? Well, in the past it was Israel in the search of the partner for peace. Now the diplomatic record is pretty accurately summed up by Jimmy Carter himself in the book Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. How does he conclude the book? He says, Israel's continued control and colonization of Palestinian land have been the primary obstacles to a comprehensive peace agreement. Peace will come to Israel and the Middle East only when the Israeli government is willing to comply with international law by accepting its legal borders. If you look everywhere, in the legal diplomatic arena, you look at the International Court of Justice, 2004, July, it renders a landmark opinion on the wall that Israel has been building in the occupied territories. What does it conclude? It concludes number one, the whole of the West Bank and Gaza, the whole. They say these are not disputed territories. These are occupied Palestinian territories. Number two, it concludes the settlements. All the settlements that Israel has built, the International Court says are illegal under international law. Number three, the question of East Jerusalem. We're told that's a controversial question. Israel calls East Jerusalem part of its eternal and undivided capital. For the highest judicial body in the world, what does it find? It says East Jerusalem is, and they're very explicit, occupied Palestinian territory. Not only do they reach all of these findings, the vote in the court is 14-1. It's not even close. And even the one dissenting vote, the one by Thomas Bergenthal, the American judge, Mr. Bergenthal, in his declaration, he says, well, there's much in the majority opinion I agree with. And then he says on the crucial question, namely the question of the settlements. If the settlements are illegal, the occupation is over, because Israel is obviously not trying to appropriate the land or annex it for its scenic value. They want to exploit the resources and transfer the population. So if the settlements are illegal, the game is up. Well, Bergenthal, he's the one negative vote. Bergenthal says, I agree with the majority. All the settlements are illegal under international law. And so what you have is a consensus, all 15 members of the highest judicial body in the world now, on every significant issue, Israel suffers a devastating defeat. Or you take not a judicial body, you take the highest political body in the world, United Nations General Assembly. Every year they vote on that two-state settlement on the June 1967 border. Every year the vote is the same. 1989, the vote's 151-3. The whole world on one side, United States, Israel, and Dominica on the other side. You look at the last 10 years, the vote's always roughly on the order of 155-2, and the maximum it ever gets up to is 161 or so to 7. This past year it was 161-7. Well, 7 is obviously bigger than 2, but it's not much bigger when you consider that the other two, apart from the United States and Israel, are Nauru, N-A-U-R-U, Palau, P-A-L-A-U, Tuvalu, T-U-V-A-L-U, Federated States of Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. That's it. The whole world, that's literally the case. I mean, it's kind of funny, but it's also kind of tragic. If you go back home, you just Google, enter the words peaceful settlement of the Palestine question. That's the annual UNGA, United Nations General Assembly resolution. And the numbers will come up. That's what it is. The whole world on one side, the United States and Israel, and Maro Palau Tavallo. On the other side, International Court of Justice, it's 14-1. On the crucial issue, it's 15-0. Again, you're Jewish, you're liberal, rule of law. It's very hard to reconcile what the highest judicial body in the world says, including Bergenthal, who himself, incidentally, is a Holocaust survivor, including Ruth Higgins. She's Jewish, she's the British representative of the court. There's no debate anymore. There's no controversy anymore when you look at the actual record, and it's becoming more and more difficult. The last topic, which I'll briefly look at, and one which I think is of great interest, in many ways the most revealing aspect, is the question of Israel's foreign policy and how American Jews are becoming more and more alienated from Israeli foreign policy. Let's take the two most recent cases, the cases of Iraq and Iran. In both the case of Iraq and Iran, Israeli elites, as well as the Israeli public, overwhelmingly supported a U.S. attack. And in both instances, Iraq and Iran, Israel compared the threat posed to Nazi Germany. Yet, in both instances, American Jews, even though Israel was saying we're facing a threat comparable to Nazi Germany, in both instances, American Jews proved remarkably unresponsive. On the eve of the attack on Iraq, American Jewry was split on whether to attack, even though Americans in general overwhelmingly supported an attack. In the war's aftermath, of all religious denominations, American Jews have been most critical of the Iraq War, although a majority of Israelis continue to support it. We take the case of Iran, the projected war on Iran. People like Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, the former Israeli prime minister and still leader of the Likud party, Mr. Netanyahu goes around saying, quote, Iran is Germany. It's 1938, except that this Nazi regime wants to dominate the world, annihilate the Jews, and also annihilate America. Well, that sounds like a pretty nasty piece of work, Iran. Wants to annihilate the Jews, annihilate the world, the universe, terrible, horrible. And the American Jewish Committee then asked American Jews, hey, what do you think about this? They want to annihilate Israel. How do you feel about it? Well, American Jews were asked, if the U.S. were to attack Iran to prevent it from developing nuclear weapons, would you support it? Surprise, 60% of American Jews said no. Which, if Mr. Netanyahu is correct, basically means American Jews are saying we don't care if it annihilates Israel. Our answer is no. Well, what happened? I think a couple of things happened. Number one, American Jews, as I said, embraced Israel after June 67 because it seemed to embody liberal values. And it's because of those same liberal values of American Jews that they are not supporting the war. In the liberal democratic milieu, which is where democratic with a capital D, where most Jews find themselves, the war was clearly unpopular. And so American Jews act like liberal Americans. They oppose the war, whatever Israel says. But that's not the only issue, because there was another interesting finding. It found that, let's say, 50% of members of the Democratic Party, or I should say Democrats with a capital D, opposed the war. But then when it came to Jews, it was 70%. And so the question arose, it can't just be that they are liberal. There must be something else at work. And I do think there's something else at work, and it goes back to exactly what I said earlier. Namely, American Jews, they distanced themselves from Israel between 48 and 67 because they were very fearful of that dual loyalty charge. And now that dual loyalty charge resurfaced. Namely, Israel and Jews were now being blamed for the war in Iraq. And so the more the war in Iraq went south, and the more it began to be said that American Jews were the cause of that war, most notably by, in some version, Mearsheimer and Walt, the more American Jews began to distance themselves from Israeli policy because it was damaging their interests as American Jews. The issue again arose of dual loyalty. And the moment the dual loyalty issue arises, American Jews pushed Israel away. The reasonable assumption is that the divide between American Jews and Israel will grow wider as Israeli policy, foreign policy, becomes more truculent and isolated from world opinion. You take the example just this past year, all of you will remember the National Intelligence Estimate concludes that Iran is no longer involved in the program of nuclear weapons program. And the whole world breathes a sigh of relief. There's not going to be a war with Iran. The majority of Americans breathe a sigh of relief. There's not going to be a war with Iran. Well, the whole world except Israel. Israel is the only country in the world which immediately denounced the NIE findings, saying they were not true, and that Iran is involved in a war in a nuclear weapons program, and it needs to be attacked. Now, for American Jewry, it's just a very hard position. Most American Jews nowadays, they grew up in a generation which the slogan was, and it was not the worst slogan, was "Give peace a chance." The John Lennon slogan, "All we are saying is give." Why are you laughing? You heartless, hedonist, black, whatever. Okay. And it's not really a rhetorical claim to say, it's literally true that Israel's motto is give war a chance. Whenever there is any option, attack. Take out the club, break their skulls. And that's true. And that has become, for many American Jews, it's simply become unpalatable. It just doesn't sound very liberal. It's not what John and Yoko would have said. Not that they were Jewish. And so you see this considerable divide opening up. There was an interesting comment by this absolutely wretched creature named Shmuel Rosner. He's the American correspondent for Haaretz. But he said something, a broken clock is right twice a day. And he had something interesting to say. In early 2007, he said as follows: "The Jews of Israel comprise perhaps the most sympathetic group towards Bush in the entire world. They are certainly more supportive than the general American public, and may very well be more sympathetic than any particular group of Americans. On the other hand, American Jews constitute one of the least sympathetic groups. A vast majority of them oppose Bush. Indeed, many really loathe him. The overwhelming majority of Jewish Israelis do not agree with the statement that Bush is dangerous for the world, as the majority of people in Western countries hold, not to speak of public opinion toward Bush in the Middle East. Before the presidential election 2 years ago, Bush was clearly preferred by Jewish Israelis over his rival, John Kerry. But the Jews of America voted en masse for Kerry. Some American Jews have a hard time digesting a reality in which an Israeli prime minister can stand at Bush's side and describe the war in Iraq as an achievement. That's how huge the chasm has become. If you look at the pose of foreign policy of Americans in general, Israeli Jews most resemble, in their attitudes towards war, most resemble white evangelical Protestants and Mormons. And it's hard to name two groups with whom American Jews have less in common. And also, the political affiliation is a mirror image. If you look at the numbers for Israelis, overwhelmingly concentrated on the right, a relatively a figure of around 30% in the middle and about 20% on the left of the Israeli spectrum. It's about 60, 25, 25. And if you look at the American Jewish spectrum, it's the exact reverse. It's about 60% on the left, 30% in the middle, and about 20% on the right, Republican. They're mirror image. They are the reverse of each other. Well, where does that all leave us? American Jewry basically has only two options. One, they can, like some Israelis have done, like people like Benny Morris, they can jettison their liberal values, just get rid of them, and become another right-winger. But that's quite unlikely because American liberal culture remains quite lively, unlike Israeli culture. It's not, the liberal portion is no longer lively. The liberal Israeli intellectuals are leaving Israel and going elsewhere. In American society, liberal culture remains quite lively, as the Barack Obama phenomenon demonstrates. And American Jews have played a formative role in liberal American culture, and have also thrived in that culture, so it's very unlikely that they're going to abandon those values. The more likely scenario is probably that American Jewry will cast Israel adrift, that it will return pretty much to what it was like before June 1967. Israel will be the object of occasional charity, a rallying point in times of existential crisis. Israel will be like, for those of you who knew the old world, will be like the Meshuggah ant. Meshuggah, the Yiddish for crazy, the Meshuggah ant who you put up in the attic because of what the neighbors might think. And Israel is like the Meshuggah ant that it's kind of an embarrassment, and you would like, or you would prefer to forget about. In my view, for what it's worth, the breakup of American Zionism is probably not only great for Israel, for Palestinians, it'll also be great, or certainly an improvement for Israelis. Because since the 1967 war, Israel has basically been a stage on which American Jews have played out all sorts of infantile and, in my view, sick fantasies, and also useful for their power and privilege. I don't think American Jews ever really cared about Israel any more than they ever cared about the Nazi Holocaust. It was a kind of game, you take someone like Professor Dershowitz, it's a way to prove that you have chutzpah and you have nerve and you're not afraid to buck the tide. It has nothing to do with any particular interest for or concern about Israel. If Israel has become a crazy state, and it has, it's in no small part due to American Jews, by abetting its worst tendencies and freeing Israel from needful restraints. American Jews have exerted a terrible influence on Israeli society. And I think Palestinians as well as Israelis will benefit when, and the day is probably not far off, American Jewry bids Israel farewell. Okay, that's it.
You've been listening to a presentation by independent scholar and author Norman Finkelstein. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the program. The title of Dr. Finkelstein's lecture is The Coming Breakup of American Zionism. He spoke at Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington on May 8, 2008. Norman Finkelstein has written extensively on the Israel-Palestine conflict and related issues. His books include Image and Reality of the Israel-Palestine Conflict, The Rise and Fall of Palestine, a personal account of the Intifada years, A Nation on Trial, The Goldhagen Thesis and Historical Truth, The Holocaust Industry, Reflections on the Exploitation of Jewish Suffering, and Beyond Chutzpah, on the Misuse of Anti-Semitism and the Abuse of History. To find out more about Norman Finkelstein and his work, please visit his website at www.normanfinkelstein.com. And now we return to the question and answer segment of the program. You're listening to independent scholar and author Norman Finkelstein.
Thank you for having me, and thanking you for that generous introduction. I don't really consider myself in exile. In former life, I was a follower of Chairman Mao Zedong, live like him, dare to struggle, dare to win. That's what I sound like when I was your age. And one of my favorite stories with Mao Zedong was, for those of you who know the history, in 1965, he was isolated in the Chinese Communist Party. He was in exile, as it were. And the famous story is that he meets the French cultural minister, André Malraux, at the Forbidden City. And as Malraux is leaving Chairman Mao and entering his limousine, Mao walks over to him and whispers in his ear, "I am alone with the masses." So I like to think I'm alone with the masses. I had several possible lecture topics for this evening, and this, I think, is a generally informed audience, and the kinds of topics I normally speak about would be maybe more heavily footnoted, but the general message, I think, would be familiar to people in this room. And so I decided at the last minute to talk about a different topic this evening, one which would be of more interest perhaps to an activist audience, and also because several people were kind enough to drive me here, and I wouldn't want to inflict on them the same lecture. Unlike Fidel, I do have a sensitivity for the audience I'm speaking to. So the topic I'll speak about this evening is the one that I'm currently writing about, and which I think will be of some interest. The formal title, the title of the book is A Farewell to Israel, the Coming Breakup of American Zionism. And basically what the topic is, or I should say the origin, the genesis of the topic is that I've noticed in the last few years. I've been active, as Adam said. I first became publicly active in the Israel-Palestine conflict in June 1982 when Israel invaded Lebanon. And so we're already at a quarter-century anniversary of sorts. And the thing that's most striking in recent years is the complete collapse of the other side, as it were. And as somebody who wrote to me the other day from Columbia University, he said that now in public events, it's almost becoming too easy. The other side doesn't show up. When they do, they're very cautious about what they say. And what you basically see as a general picture is that those who are supporting Israel are now on college campuses reduced to an ethnic core. It's only the Jewish students, and of the Jewish students, it's really only about a third. 1/3, the Hillel crowd, 1/3 are basically indifferent, and 1/3 are supporting the other side, our side. Now, whereas with the Palestinian side, it's gone now well beyond the ethnic core. It's now reaching well into the mainstream. At a typical audience, the audience won't be more than 1/5 or 1/6 Arab or Muslim. It's going to be overwhelmingly pretty mainstream people who are showing up. And the crowds are getting larger. The crowds, for Israel are getting significantly smaller. And so basically what I want to look at is how do you account for this phenomenon? What exactly is going on? And that's what I want to talk about this evening. In order to do so, you have to have some historical background, and also you have to shed a large number of myths, which unfortunately many people, I think, mistakenly assume, especially the younger generation. There's the famous line often quoted of the Hungarian Marxist George Lukács that you have to look at the present as history. And I think very often, especially with this conflict, people don't see or don't know or are unfamiliar with the historical context. So we'll go back a little ways to try to flesh in that context, and its relevance will become clear as I proceed. It will come as a surprise, I think, to many of the younger people in the room that Israel only recently became a focus of American Jewish life. After World War II, the barriers to Jewish assimilation began rapidly to fall away. Before World War II, there were significant barriers to Jewish entry into the professions. If you looked at, for example, the Ivy League universities, only a handful of Jews taught there. And Professor Chomsky, for example, likes to tell the story that the reason MIT became a first-rate science and engineering school is because it didn't allow any Jewish mathematicians, or I should say Harvard didn't allow any Jewish mathematicians or physicists on its faculty, and so they all ended up walking down the street to MIT. And that was the picture, basically, until after World War II. Now the barriers to Jewish assimilation begin to fall away, and the opportunities for Jewish power and privilege, as it were, the American dream, begin to open up for American Jewry. And it's exactly at this moment when opportunities are now beckoning that this state of Israel is the state of Israel is created. And this state of Israel claims to be the state of the Jewish people, to speak in the name of the Jewish people, and also claims the primary loyalty of the Jewish people. And in many ways, this is now a catastrophe for American Jews, because Jews have historically always been burdened with this claim or this bogey of what's called dual loyalty. That is, Jews are loyal to their nation state, but they have a higher loyalty to international Jewry, from which all of this stuff about the international Jewish conspiracy and so forth arise. Well, now all of a sudden a state emerges which claims the primary loyalty of world Jewry. And the dual loyalty bogey suddenly now has a concrete institutional form. It's no longer just a creation or myth. It's now a factual reality. David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, he says in the early 1950s that Jews must assist the state of Israel in all conditions and under any circumstances, whether the government to which the Jews in question owe allegiance desire it or not. And when he made this statement, it created a veritable hysteria among American Jewry, who became very frightened that here he was, as it were, advertising to the world that Jews are not loyal to the United States. Their first loyalty is to Israel. Afterwards, there was a lot of back and forth diplomacy, and Ben-Gurion was effectively compelled to retract the statement, but the institutional fact remained. And so what this means in concrete terms, which only people who are very much older than most in this room would know, is that from 1948 to 1967, Israel figured barely at